Thanks very much, Ken, and thanks to all of you for coming today. Thanks to my friends whom I see in the audience, some of whom I thanked in the acknowledgments to the book, but I'll thank you again from the Lebanese contingent, like Firas Maqsad, Hussein Abdul Hussein, Jan Al-Hor, to some of my American friends like Andrew Tabler, Matt Pilcher, and Samantha Ravitch. I also want to thank my colleagues at Hudson, the board, scholars, and staff, and especially today's moderator, Hudson CEO Ken Weinstein. Thanks for your support and advice. Thanks for your loyalty and your friendship, and especially your great good humor. I'm also greatly indebted to my two fellow panelists this afternoon, and not just for agreeing to participate in order to make this an interesting event. It is decidedly an honor and privilege to share this panel with Assistant Secretary Feltman and Mr. Abrams, not least because their efforts in the Middle East have played such a signal role in American policy over the last 9 years, and also in my thinking about the region. It was, as I write in the book, it was a great time to be an American in the region. It was a privilege to be represented by a U.S. government that had taken the side of freedom. I lived in Beirut during the heyday of what we've come to call the Cedar Revolution, where many Lebanese regarded Mr. Abrams as President Bush's Deputy National Security Advisor for a global democracy strategy, and Assistant Secretary Feltman, when he was the U.S. Ambassador to Lebanon, as heroes of a sort, and many of them still do, as do I. Thus, they are among the book's tutelary spirits, a designation from which they may, in due course, wish to distance themselves, but there you have it. I want to be very brief, not just because I'd prefer to have you read the book than hear me talk about it, but largely because I'm as eager as you likely are to listen to Mr. Feltman and Mr. Abrams describe the current career of U.S. policy and perhaps debate over it. After all, they've labored in the field while I've merely observed how it played out on the ground, and yet it was while watching U.S. strategy in the Middle East unfold that provided much of the impetus for this book. So The Strong Horse is partly about regional transformation as well as a transformation in my own thinking about the region. In particular, why did these very good policies not succeed as intended? Or why has democracy not caught on in the Middle East to date? The convenient explanation is that these policies were indeed the right ones, that is, supporting the democratic aspirations of Arabs and standing against both Islamist militants and the region's repressive regimes was correct. The problem, rather, was that the Bush administration failed in implementing them. No doubt the previous White House made many errors, some of them deadly, to Americans as well as Arabs. One ringingly specific piece of criticism is that the Americans should have provided more security and earlier on than they did. My more general criticism is this, however, that we should have taken the Arabs' fears more seriously. We Americans believed we were bringing democracy to the region while discounting as a far-fetched conspiracy theory the long-held conviction of many Arabs that someday the Americans would come to play divide and conquer, that someday the Arabs would set each other at each other's throats. As it turned out, in too many places across the region, that's exactly what happened. Of course, it wasn't America's hand that blew up mosques in Iraq. Abu Musab al-Zarqawi wasn't on Washington's payroll when he slaughtered Shia, nor was Hassan Nasrallah acting on behalf of CENTCOM when Hezbollah killed Sunnis in West Beirut and Druze in the Shuf Mountains. It wasn't the Bush administration that conducted a campaign of terror in Beirut, assassinating Lebanese politicians, journalists, and civil society activists, and the U.S. Department of State sentenced no opposition figures, intellectuals, journalists, or bloggers to prisons in Syria, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and elsewhere around the Middle East, where they were subject to torture, rape, and murder. It was Arabs who did this to other Arabs. It was precisely this vicious political culture, the Americans believed, that had nurtured a hothouse flower like Osama bin Laden. These regimes were so relentlessly cruel to their own peoples that the only option the Arab masses had for political expression was a version of Islam as bloody-minded as the regimes themselves. And so the Americans would give the Arabs another choice: democracy, freedom, by speaking over the heads of Arab leaders and targeting the worst regimes, starting with Saddam Hussein. As the Al-Hayat columnist Hazem Saghia put it, describing the chaos of post-invasion Iraq circa 2005-2006, the Arabs thought the problem was colonialism, Zionism, the Americans, etc. And the Americans thought the problem was Saddam's regime. The problem, however, as it turned out, was Arab society itself. On reflection, and from a distance, the paradox is obvious. A political culture where bin Ladenism is not the exception, but the political norm, does not easily lend itself to remedy, never mind transformation. And that, in short, is the subject of my book, the issues, or some of the issues that have set the Arabs against themselves. A clash of Arab civilizations, clashes between sects and confessions, between Arab regimes and their own people, the regimes against their domestic rivals and insurgencies, clashes between Arab regimes themselves, between and within families, and even inside the Arab individual. Perhaps most importantly, there is the clash between worldviews, where on one hand there is the democratic and progressive trend embodied in the venerable and still extant tradition of Arab liberalism, and on the other, the bloody and violent current represented by far too many of the region's seminal figures, from Saddam and bin Laden, Nasrallah and Zarqawi, Bashar al-Assad and Khalid Mashal, among others. However, while I do believe there is a real clash between worldviews, Arab worldviews, for the future and destiny of the region, unlike many, I do not believe there is anything like a civil war in the Arabic-speaking Middle East, with the forces of liberalism pitted against the armies of resistance. Wars are waged between men with guns, and their outcome depends on how many, which way, and at whom those guns are pointed. And here the liberals, the moderates, as a minority of unarmed prophets, are at a distinct disadvantage. I hardly mean to downplay the role of ideas or the significance of the men and women who advocate those ideas. For the protagonists of my book, my heroes, are all men and women who have taken courageous stands, positions that would seem unimaginably reckless to most of us, against the region's political and cultural mainstream. A young Egyptian intellectual, Ken referred to, whose fundamentalism is German idealism and whose life ambition is to translate all of Kant into Arabic. A Cairo doctor who wants all the freedoms that America has to offer, but, as she says, in her country, her city, and her language. A Syrian father of three who, while watching President Bush's second inaugural, thanked God for the leader of the free world who was, in his words, the only man who cared about the Arabs. And then there's my friend Fawaz, a former Lebanese basketball star who, when talking about Hassan Nasrallah, explained, "He mocks those who love life, but the party of life will fight to keep it. And they will fight for it, but they won't win, not right now anyway, for at the moment at least, the region is in the hands of those with guns, those who prize death." That said, I should say something about the title. The phrase, as you'll recall, is Osama bin Laden's. When people see a strong horse and a weak horse, by nature they will like the strong horse. I anticipate that this will be confused with the notion that Arabs understand only force, an idea unfortunately and incorrectly attributed to the Bush administration. The fact is that throughout history, most of mankind has understood force. Those lucky few who are fortunate enough to be able to live their political lives free of the fear of violence are largely concentrated in the capitals of contemporary Western Europe and along the east and west coasts of the United States. The inhabitants of the Arabic-speaking Middle East are not so fortunate. To say that Lebanon is held at gunpoint by an armed gang, or that Syrian intellectuals and Egyptian rights activists are typically thrown in prison and tortured, that regional minorities like the Shia, Druze, Alawi, Christians, Kurds, and Jews have often been the target of purges and political violence, all in the name of Arab nationalism, a corporatist ideology that seeks to erase communal as well as individual difference, is not to say that Arabs only understand force, but that violence is a central factor in Arab political life, and it is impossible to understand the region without taking this into account. One more thing about the book's title. The strong horse not only punishes his enemies, he also rewards and protects his friends, sometimes by punishing their enemies. This seems to me an entirely unobjectionable notion, for it is a precept derived from the most basic principle of human relations, to protect those whom you love from harm, and to be prepared to do harm to those who would injure them. Bizarrely, these principles are too often neglected by our policy establishment across the political spectrum, a culture that, among others, has counseled rapprochement, engagement, and even comity with those that have made their enmity towards us and our friends and allies clear. Prospective relationships that would invariably come at the expense of our friends and perhaps potential friends, like many of the men and women today venturing their physical safety, their lives, on the streets of Tehran.